The Great Hall of the Galactic Council had never felt so small. Ambassador Kellen watched the last of his people's distress signals fade into the cosmic void, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, entire worlds were being devoured. His crystalline skin caught the red emergency lights that had been flashing for weeks now, casting eerie shadows across the chamber, where representatives from 12 dying civilizations sat in stunned silence. The Verdani had always been peaceful. For 3,000 years, they had solved conflicts through meditation and careful negotiation. Their greatest military achievement was developing non-lethal stunning weapons that could disable attackers without permanent harm. Now those same gentle beings were watching their colonies disappear one by one, consumed by creatures that knew nothing of mercy or diplomacy. Kellen's 6 fingers trembled as he adjusted the long-range transmitter for what he knew would be the final time. The Devourers were only 2 systems away from the Council's heart worlds. In 72 hours, maybe less, this station would be nothing but floating debris and screaming metal. Brothers and sisters of the void, he spoke into the transmitter, his voice cracking with exhaustion. This is Ambassador Kellen of the Verdani, speaking for the Galactic Council. We are dying. The enemy we call the Devourers has consumed 17 of our worlds in 3 cycles. They strip planets bare, leaving nothing but empty rock. We have tried every weapon in our arsenal, every strategy our greatest minds could devise. Nothing works. He paused, looking around at the other ambassadors. The insectoid hive queen clicked her mandibles in nervous rhythm. The gaseous being from Proximus Cloud cities flickered with dim, frightened colors. The tree-like Groot swayed his branches in what his people called a gesture of final acceptance. We send this message to every corner of the galaxy, Kellen continued. If there are any among you who know how to fight such darkness, who have faced extinction and survived, please, we need heroes. We need saviors. We need someone who can do what we cannot. The transmission ended, and silence filled the chamber like a heavy blanket. They had sent similar messages to over 400 known civilizations. Most had already fallen to the Devourers. Others were too far away to help. A few had responded with sympathy, but no ships, no weapons, no hope. Kellen was preparing to evacuate the station when the proximity alarms began screaming. Ships were dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. Big ships. Ships that moved with predatory grace through the void, their hulls scarred by battles the peaceful races could barely imagine. The lead vessel was massive, easily twice the size of the Council's largest diplomatic cruiser. Its dark metal surface bristled with weapon arrays that looked like they could crack planets. Behind it came a fleet of smaller but equally menacing ships, each one radiating the kind of deadly efficiency that made Kellen's crystalline skin crawl with instinctive fear. The docking bays shuddered as the alien transport clamped onto their station. The airlock hissed open, and 3 figures stepped through the mist. They moved with the fluid confidence of apex predators, their eyes constantly scanning for threats that might not even exist. The first was a man with graying hair and scars that told stories of violence the council members couldn't comprehend. His uniform was practical, built for war rather than ceremony, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had made impossible choices and lived with the consequences. Behind him came a woman whose very presence seemed to change the temperature of the room. Her red hair was pulled back in a military style, and she carried herself like someone who had never backed down from a fight in her life. The third was younger, but no less dangerous. His jaw set in the kind of determined line that suggested he would follow orders no matter how terrible they might be. "I'm Captain James Morrison, Earth Defense Force," the scarred man said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from commanding in actual battles rather than diplomatic simulations. "This is Colonel Rebecca Hayes and Major Tom Bradley. You sent a distress call." The simplicity of his words somehow made them more frightening. No grand speeches about justice or heroic proclamations about saving the innocent, just a statement of fact, delivered by someone who clearly understood that war was a job, not a crusade. Kellen found his voice first among the stunned council members. "Captain Morrison, we are grateful for your response. The situation is desperate. The Devourers have—" "We know what they've done," Hayes interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "We've been tracking their advance for weeks. Impressive work for a bunch of bugs. Major Bradley was already studying the tactical displays with the kind of professional interest that made several ambassadors step backwards involuntarily. 17 worlds in 3 cycles, he murmured. They're moving faster than our projections suggested. We'll need to adjust the timeline. The way they talk about the crisis that had driven the Council to despair was somehow worse than panic would have been. These humans discuss the annihilation of billions with the same tone they might use to plan a supply run or schedule maintenance on their ships. Captain, Kellen ventured carefully, we should discuss strategy, coordinate our forces, establish proper chain of command protocols. Morrison's laugh was like ice cracking. Ambassador, with respect, your forces have been losing for months. We didn't come here to coordinate. We came here to win. As the humans began discussing their plans in low, urgent tones, Kellen caught fragments that made his crystalline blood run cold. Orbital bombardment, scorched earth tactics, acceptable civilian casualties, total warfare doctrine. Looking at his fellow council members, Kellen saw his own dawning horror reflected in their alien features. They had called across the galaxy for heroes to save them from monsters. But as he watched these scarred, efficient killers plan their campaign with casual brutality, one terrible question echoed in his mind. What happened when the cure was worse than the disease? The massive briefing room on Council Station Alpha had been designed to inspire hope. Its curved walls displayed beautiful star maps showing the peaceful trade routes that had connected dozens of civilizations for centuries. Today, those same walls showed something else entirely. Red warning lights painted everything the color of blood, and the star maps now tracked death moving across the galaxy like a plague. Captain Morrison stood at the center of the room, his weather hands moving across the holographic controls with practiced efficiency. The display flickered to life, showing a three-dimensional map of local space that made every alien in the room flinch. 37 systems marked in crimson. 37 worlds that had been full of life just months ago, now stripped bare by an enemy that consumed everything in its path. Current situation, Morrison began, his voice carrying the flat tone of a man who had delivered too many death sentences. Devourer fleets are advancing on 3 primary vectors. Fleet Alpha is pushing to the Centauri Gap. Fleet Beta is moving along the old trade routes toward your core worlds, and Fleet Gamma just broke through your outer defensive line at Kepler. Ambassador Kellen watched the red arrows creep across the map like fingers reaching for his throat. Each arrow represented millions of those creatures, each one hungry enough to strip an entire planet clean in days. His people had tried everything: negotiation, defensive barriers, even offering tribute. Nothing worked. The Devourers simply consumed and moved on. We estimate 6 weeks before they reach your primary population centers, Morrison continued, unless we establish proper kill zones. His finger traced lines across the map, drawing boundaries that cut through inhabited systems like a butcher marking cuts of meat. Each line represented a decision that would have taken the Council months to debate, and Morrison drew them in seconds. Standard doctrine for this type of engagement. He announced to Colonel Hayes and Major Bradley, we established defensive positions here, and here. Full orbital coverage. Overlapping fields of fire. Acceptable losses are 15% civilian casualties per major engagement, with emergency protocols allowing up to 25% if tactical situations require immediate response. The numbers hit Ambassador Kellen like physical blows. 15% on his home world alone. That meant 60 million of his people. He tried to speak, but only a wheeze emerged from his breathing apparatus. Captain, he finally managed, his crystalline voice cracking with strain. Those are populated worlds with billions of innocent beings. Families, children, entire cultures that have existed for thousands of years. Surely there must be some other way to acceptable losses. Colonel Hayes cut him off, her green eyes as cold as vacuum. She leaned forward, her red hair catching the harsh briefing room lights. Ambassador, would you prefer 90% casualties when the Devourers show up and start eating everyone? Because that's what happened on the last 17 worlds you try to defend with your careful, honorable tactics. The alien council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They had spent decades crafting careful treaties about humanitarian conduct during warfare, rules about protecting civilians, preserving cultural sites, minimizing environmental damage. Beautiful documents that meant nothing to an enemy that viewed entire civilizations as food. Major Bradley was studying the tactical reports with the focused intensity of a man reading a shopping list. His young face showed no emotion as he scrolled through casualty figures that represented the deaths of entire species. "Your enemy doesn't follow your rules," he observed, looking up from his datapad. "They don't distinguish between military and civilian targets. They don't preserve cultural artifacts or sacred sites. They don't take prisoners or negotiate surrender terms. So, why you keep fighting like they do?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ambassador Kellen looked around at his fellow council members, seeing his own confusion reflected in their alien features. For generations, they had believed that civilization meant fighting with honor, that the way you won a war was as important as winning itself. "Because we're not monsters," whispered Ambassador Thalen of the Proxima Colonies, her butterfly wings trembling with emotion. Morrison's laugh was sharp and completely without humor. "Honors for the living, Ambassador. Dead heroes don't save anybody. Your beautiful principles are lovely, but they're getting your people killed by the billions." He gestured to the holographic display, where the red markers continued their inexorable advance toward the Council's core worlds. "You've been fighting a total war with peacekeeping tactics. That's not noble. That's suicide." Colonel Hayes stood up, her movement precise and military. "We've reviewed your battle reports from the last 6 months. Every single engagement follows the same pattern. You establish defensive perimeters. You follow your rules of engagement, and you get slaughtered. Then you retreat, regroup, and do the exact same thing at the next system." "What would you have us do?" demanded Admiral Zirian of the Deep Space Federation, his tentacles writhing with frustration. "Become like them? Abandon everything that makes us civilized?" Major Bradley looked up from his reports with the kind of expression that suggested he was explaining something obvious to a small child. "You want to stay civilized? Fine. But civilization is a luxury you pay for with security. Right now, you can't afford that luxury." The briefing room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Outside the viewing ports, alien ships drifted in formation, their sleek designs built for exploration and peaceful trade. In contrast, the human vessels looked like instruments of war, all sharp angles and weapon ports. Ambassador Kellen realized with growing horror that the humans weren't suggesting they become monsters. They were pointing out that in this war, the monsters were the only ones still breathing. The choice wasn't between good and evil anymore. It was between survival and extinction. And as he looked at Captain Morrison's scarred face and cold eyes, Kellen understood the terrible truth they had all been avoiding. They hadn't called for knights in shining armor to save them from the darkness. They had summoned the darkness itself, hoping it would be on their side. The alarms had been screaming for 3 hours when the Devourer fleet finally appeared at Kepler Station. Ambassador Kellen watched from the command bridge as hundreds of enemy ships dropped out of hyperspace like a swarm of mechanical locusts, their dark hulls reflecting no light as they moved toward the heavily defended mining station. All ships, assume formation Delta 7, Admiral Theron commanded over communications array. His crystalline features glowed with determination as he coordinated the Council's defensive fleet. "Remember, we protect the civilian evacuation transports at all costs. No ship fires until the enemy crosses the designated engagement zone." Kellen felt a surge of pride watching the alien fleet move into perfect formation. Sleek Verdani cruisers took positions alongside the massive Crystalline Coalition battleships, while smaller vessels from a dozen other worlds formed protective screens around the evacuation ships. It was beautiful in its precision, a testament to thousands of years of civilized warfare. Captain Morrison stood nearby, his scarred hands clasped behind his back as he watched the alien formations with what looked like professional interest. His human ships hung back from the main fleet, almost invisible against the asteroid field that surrounded Kepler Station. "Beautiful formation," Morrison said quietly. "Very precise, very predictable." Something in his tone made Kellen's crystalline skin crawl with unease. "Captain, shouldn't your ships be joining the defensive line? The Devourers will be in weapons range in 20 minutes. Morrison turned to look at him, And Kellen saw something in those cold human eyes that made him step backwards. Our ships are exactly where they need to be, Ambassador. The battle began exactly as every council engagement had for the past 6 months. The Devourer fleet charged forward in their usual chaotic swarm, ignoring the careful defensive formations as they rushed toward their targets. Council ships opened fire at maximum range, their energy beams lancing out in precise, measured volleys designed to disable rather than destroy. Maintain formation, Admiral Theron commanded as the first Devourer ships absorbed the defensive fire and kept coming. All ships, target their propulsion systems. We must minimize casualties while... Sir, they're not slowing down, reported his tactical officer, panic creeping into her crystalline voice. Their ships are heavily shielded. Our weapons aren't penetrating. Kellen watched in growing horror as the Devourer fleet smashed into the Council's defensive line like a hammer hitting glass. The careful formation scattered as alien ships were overwhelmed by enemies that fought with no regard for their own losses. Evacuation transports exploded in brilliant flashes of light, taking thousands of civilians with them. Where are the humans? Admiral Theron demanded, his formation collapsing around him. Why aren't they supporting our flank? That's when Kellen noticed something strange. The human ships had vanished completely from his sensors. One moment they'd been hanging back near the asteroid field. The next they were simply gone. What are they doing? Admiral Theron demanded over the communications channel, his voice rising with desperation as another of his cruisers went silent. His answer came in the form of massive explosions blooming behind the Devourer fleet. Human warships materialized like ghosts among the enemy's rear guard, their weapon systems firing with a precision that made the Council's careful shots look like children's toys. But they weren't targeting the main battle fleet. Those are supply ships. Colonel Hayes' voice crackled over the radio as her bombers swept through confusion behind enemy lines. Communication relays. Command vessels. Anyone ever teach you people to hit the brain instead of the claws? The Devourer formation, which had been advancing with mechanical precision just moments before, suddenly dissolved into chaos. Ships that had been coordinating their attacks began firing randomly as their communication network collapsed. Supply vessels carrying replacement troops and ammunition became expanding clouds of debris. Captain Morrison's ships moved through confusion like wolves among sheep, targeting anything that looked important with weapons that seemed designed for one purpose: complete destruction. No warning shots, no attempts to disable, just efficient, brutal killing. Those are civilian transports. Ambassador Kellen protested as he watched human fighters strafe a cluster of enemy vessels. Major Bradley's voice came back cold and matter-of-fact. Those are troop carriers, Ambassador. Your scanners just aren't military grade. Each one of those civilian ships is packed with Devourer soldiers heading for your evacuation zones. Within 2 hours, the battle was over. The Devourer fleet that seemed unstoppable was either destroyed or fleeing in complete disarray. The humans had won decisively, losing only 3 ships in process. But as Kellen looked at the tactical displays showing the aftermath, he felt sick. The humans had targeted everything: supply ships, communication relays, even vessels that might have contained prisoners or wounded enemies. They had shown no mercy, offered no quarter, followed none of the traditional rules that had governed galactic warfare for millennia. Effective engagement, Morrison reported to the Council, as if he had just completed a routine training exercise. Minimal friendly casualties, maximum enemy losses. We should be able to implement similar tactics across all 3 fronts. The Council chamber erupted in heated debate. Representatives demanded investigations into human tactics, called for formal protests, threatened to expel Earth from the coalition entirely. But underneath their outrage, Kellen could hear something else: relief. For the first time in months, they had actually won. Colonel Hayes stood up, her green eyes sweeping across the assembled aliens with obvious disdain. "You can expel us if you want," she said simply. "But we're the only ones actually winning battles. Your choice." When the vote came, it was closer than anyone wanted to admit. The motion to expel humanity from the coalition failed by exactly 3 votes. Kellen realized they had crossed a line they could never uncross. They were still alive, but at what cost? The emergency session of the Galactic Council was supposed to be a celebration. 3 months of human-led victories had pushed the Devourers back from the core worlds, and for the first time since the war began, there was talk of actually winning. Instead, Ambassador Kellen found himself staring at a tactical display that made his crystalline blood run cold. 40 red markers had appeared overnight. 40 systems that had been safe just days ago were now under attack or completely dark. The Devourers had struck back with a coordinated assault that made their previous attacks look like gentle probes. They learned, Captain Morrison said simply, his scarred face showing no surprise as he studied the disaster unfolding across the galaxy. Adapted to our tactics faster than we expected. Smart bugs. The Devourer counteroffensive had come like a force of nature. Their ships no longer charged straight into human kill zones, but instead used the same hit-and-run tactics that had made the Earth forces so effective. They targeted communication relays first, then supply lines, leaving Council fleets isolated and confused before moving in for systematic destruction. "We're losing entire fleets," Admiral Theron reported, his usually confident voice shaking with exhaustion. "They're using our own strategies against us, hitting our rear lines, targeting our evacuation routes. It's like they studied every human engagement and turned it around." Ambassador Kellen felt the weight of those 40 fallen systems pressing down on him like a physical force. Billions of beings had died in 2 weeks, and the casualty reports kept climbing. The careful evacuation plans that had saved so many lives during the early human victories had become death traps as the Devourers learned to target fleeing civilians first. "Captain Morrison," Kellen said quietly, approaching the human commander after the official briefing had ended, "we need to speak privately." They walked to Morrison's temporary quarters, a small room that the human had converted into something that looked more like a military bunker than diplomatic housing. Maps covered every wall, marked with notations in the harsh, angular script that humans use for military planning. "We're losing," Kellen admitted, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. "Our forces, our commanders, they don't know how to fight this kind of war. They're trained for peacekeeping, for defensive actions against conventional enemies. But this," he gestured helplessly at the tactical displays, "this is something else entirely." Morrison poured himself a cup of the bitter black liquid that humans seem to consume constantly during stressful situations. "Your people can learn," he said after a long moment. "Question is, do they want to live badly enough to become what they need to become?" The transformation began quietly, almost invisibly. Colonel Hayes started spending more time with Verdani fleet commanders, offering what she called tactical consultations. She would sit with them over meals, speaking in calm, reasonable tones about acceptable casualty rates and the mathematics of survival. "You see, Commander Zephyr," she would say to the young Verdani officer, her voice as gentle as a teacher explaining simple arithmetic, "when you're protecting an evacuation convoy, you can't save everyone. But if you're willing to sacrifice one transport to draw enemy fire, you can save the other 9. It's just numbers." Major Bradley took a different approach with the Crystalline Coalition forces. He worked with their tactical computers, showing them how to calculate enemy civilian population centers and infrastructure targets that would cause maximum psychological damage. "Break their morale," he explained to Admiral Theron during one of their private strategy sessions. "Hit their supply worlds, their nursery colonies, anything that makes them feel vulnerable. Fear is a weapon just like any other." The changes came faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, former peacekeepers were implementing strategies that would have horrified them months earlier. Verdani ships began targeting Devourer supply convoys, carrying what intelligence suggested were non-combatant populations. Crystalline forces started using weapons designed to cause maximum suffering rather than quick death. Captain Robert Stone, a quiet human officer who specialized in biological warfare, spent his time with the pacifist Helios Republic. They had never developed any weapons more dangerous than stun beams, but Stone showed them how their agricultural technology could be repurposed for darker ends. "It's just modified fertilizer," he explained to their horrified scientists. "Deployed in their atmosphere, and their immune systems shut down within hours. Clean, efficient, no radiation or lasting environmental damage." The results were undeniable. For the first time since the war began, Council forces started winning consistently. Enemy fleets found their supply lines cut, their rear areas under constant attack, their civilian populations targeted with the same ruthless efficiency they had shown others. But Kellen noticed something disturbing in the reports. The language was changing. Terms like acceptable losses and strategic necessities were creeping into official communications. Orders that would have required council votes and ethical reviews were being issued by individual commanders who had learned to think like their human advisors. "We've won 12 straight engagements," Admiral Theron reported during the next council session, but something had changed in his crystalline features. They seemed duller somehow, as if the light that had once shone through them had been dimmed by what he'd seen and done. Morrison nodded with obvious approval. "You're thinking like humans now." The word should have been a compliment, but they landed in the chamber like a death sentence. Looking around at his fellow council members, Kellen saw beings who had once dedicated their lives to peace and understanding now discussing orbital bombardment schedules and prisoner interrogation techniques with the same casual efficiency as their human teachers. They were winning the war, but Kellen couldn't shake the feeling that they had already lost something far more important. The question was whether they would remember what it was when the fighting finally ended. The fires on Devourer Prime had been burning for 3 straight days when the last enemy transmission finally went silent. Ambassador Kellen stood at the observation deck of Council Station Alpha, watching the distant orange glow that marked the end of a war that had consumed half the galaxy. The final Devourer stronghold was nothing but molten rock and twisted metal now, its population of billions reduced to ash that would drift through space for centuries. He should have felt relief. Joy, even. The nightmare that had haunted his people for over a year was finally over. But as he looked at the tactical displays showing the systematic destruction of every Devourer world, colony, and outpost, Kellen felt only a hollow emptiness where his hope used to live. The council chamber had never been so quiet. Representatives from surviving species sat in their designated seats, but something fundamental had changed in all of them. The Verdani delegation wore military uniforms instead of their traditional robes of peace. The Crystalline Coalition members carried sidearms that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Even the gentle tree beings from the Outer Gardens had developed what they now call defensive spores that could kill entire ecosystems if deployed properly. Captain Morrison entered the chamber with the same measured stride he had used throughout the war. His weathered face showed no emotion as he approached the central podium, his cold eyes scanning the assembled aliens with the practiced assessment of a professional soldier. "The threat is eliminated," he announced in the same flat tone he might use to report successful equipment maintenance. "All Devourer strongholds have been neutralized. Their fleet assets are destroyed, their command structure is broken, and their remaining population centers have been rendered uninhabitable. Earth Defense Force ships will be withdrawing from this sector within 72 hours. The word should have brought cheers, celebrations, parades in the streets of every surviving world. Instead, they landed in the chamber like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples of discomfort that spread to the assembled representatives. Ambassador Kellen looked around at his fellow council members and saw the transformation that had taken place during the long months of war. The Verdani had developed orbital bombardment capabilities that could glass entire continents in hours. Their ships now carried weapons that made their old stunning devices look like children's toys. The Crystalline Coalition had gone even further, establishing research facilities dedicated to biological warfare. Admiral Theron had personally overseen the development of viral agents specifically designed to target Devourer physiology, weapons that killed slowly and painfully to maximize psychological impact on enemy forces. The peaceful Helios Republic, once famous for their philosophical debates about the sanctity of all life, had established mandatory military conscription for every citizen over the age of 16. Their former meditation centers had been converted into training facilities where young beings learned to kill efficiently and without hesitation. "What have we become?" Kellen asked, the question escaping his lips before he could stop it. The words echoed in the chamber, hanging in the air like an accusation. Colonel Hayes was packing the last of her tactical manuals into a transport case, her red hair catching the overhead lights as she worked. The manuals had been translated into 17 different alien languages during the war, turning human military doctrine into textbooks that were now required reading in academies across the galaxy. "You became what you needed to become to survive," she said without looking up from her packing. Her voice carried no judgment, no sympathy, just a cold assessment of a professional who had completed her assignment successfully. Admiral Theron stood up slowly, his crystalline features reflecting the chamber lights in ways that seemed different now, harder somehow. "We were better before," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "We had principles, codes of conduct, respect for life in all its forms." Major Bradley's smile was grim as he secured his own equipment, better in extinct or monsters and alive. "You made your choice, Admiral. Every single one of you voted to keep fighting when you could have surrendered. Every time we suggested a tactic that violated your precious principles, you authorized it because the alternative was watching your people die." The truth of his words hit the chamber like a physical blow. Kellen remembered every vote, every debate that had ended with the same conclusion. Survival trumped principle. They had chosen to become something they despised rather than die as something they respected. As the human transport prepared to depart, Captain Morrison paused at the chamber entrance. His final words would be remembered long after the war became distant history, quoted in military academies and philosophical debates across the galaxy. "You call for saviors, but salvation requires monsters," he said, his scarred face showing no emotion. "The real question isn't what we made you. It's what you'll do with what you've learned." The human ships disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind a galaxy that had survived but was forever changed. The Council still existed. The member worlds were safe, and trade routes would eventually reopen. But innocence was a luxury they could never afford again. Kellen remained at the observation deck long after the others had left, watching the distant glow of the burning Devourer worlds and wondering if the price of victory had been worth paying. They had saved the galaxy by becoming the very thing they had once fought against. The war was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The battle to remember who they used to be and decide who they wanted to become.